As you listen to what he has to say today, if you feel that what he's saying is true and correct and that we were lied to perhaps about 9/11, I'd like you to think about who paid the price for all those lies, because we as American people are broke in our country now because of 2 wars based on this, and there are countless people dead in the Middle East as well as our own military men and women. So this is a really serious subject. It deserves all of our serious thought. With that, I'd like to tell you that Dwain is the former director of aerospace research at NASA's Dryden Flight Research Center. He's the recipient of NASA's Exceptional Service Award and Presidential Emeritus Rank Award in the Senior Executive Service, 1988. He's a selected presenter of the Wright Brothers Lectureship in Aeronautics and Astronautics, and he's included in Who's Who in Science and Engineering. 37-year NASA career. So when you go to your alternative debunkers, or when you look at what we're being told by popular mechanics in terms of what the truth is, this man is a true physicist, scientist, engineer with the absolutely highest credentials, and we're so very fortunate to have him here in Ventura with us today. Thank you. Very welcome.
Thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon. But this is September 11th, the 9th anniversary. I sure wish we were further along towards the truth at this point, 9 years later. What I'm going to be covering today is one of the buildings out of the World Trade Center, Building 7. I think in that one building, the main issues are very clear, and I think even if you look no further than that building and what happened, you would have the essence of what occurred very wrongly. So if we can go to the first chart. I'm presenting this in 4 key points having to do with the building coming down. And I show it as a triangle, even though there's 4 points. And it's because I think that the 3 that precede the 4th are kind of what came together, and the result was a free fall destruction of the building. And so I put it in the inside the triangle just to kind of emphasize that aspect of it. And I use these numbers as a map, more or less, so you can keep track as I go through this part of the talk of kind of where we are relative to the 4 points. The first point is that standard fires don't bring down buildings. They're not hot enough. And the past history of fires and high-rises do not lead to buildings coming collapsing down. The second point is that there's quite a lot of evidence from very different viewpoints that all is consistent. There was extreme temperatures in the rubble and the ground under the buildings after they came down, and it continued extremely hot for weeks afterwards. This is very puzzling, how in the world this kind of thing could happen. The third item there on your right is that there is, we think, an explanation for why those temperatures were so high and persisted so long. And it has to do with some very high-tech materials, explosive materials, that were found in the dust from the World Trade Center. And then there is free fall itself, and I'll explain how that was measured and how it is important. Next chart. This is looking at the history. I said it's never happened before where buildings have completely collapsed due to fire. The vertical axis is the amount of damage. It's very subjective, but either there was no structural damage in any high-rise fire before, or there was major structural damage, but the structure still remained standing. It never came down. With the exception of 3 buildings officially emphasize officially. And that's the three at the very top, all came down in the same day, and it is officially due to fire in each of those three cases. Across the horizontal axis is the number of hours that the fires raged in the buildings. So you can see some of these, by the way, the numbers in the triangles are the number of stories that were in each building. And you can also indicate the year in which these buildings came down, but that's not really that important. I mean, it's more important to look at how long the fires raged in them. There's one photograph on the fire at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, and this is in Beijing in 2009. I mean, that's a raging fire, and it raged for 10 hours, and it did not bring the building down. So the history and the subsequent evidence, other than that one day, tells us that fires do not bring down high-rise structural buildings. Next chart. Okay, set aside the history. What do we also know about this building? And we know, as I said before, that it was extremely hot, very high temperatures. And the question is, how do we know that? We being the public. I'll start at the top and go around. There was a specimen of steel. It's called eutetic in that it had sulfur ingrained in the inner granulars, like into the molecules of the piece of steel, which meant it was so hot. It wasn't just that sulfur attached, but it had to be part of probably a liquid version of that steel. So that was found by some fire safety engineers that were contracted to FEMA. They wrote it up in their, which is called Appendix C. It was their part of the report. They were very perplexed by what caused this. And New York Times said it was the most mysterious element of the whole investigation. And finally, they urged anyone later in investigating the whole thing to dig further into what was going on with this specimen of Building 7. There is evidence of infrared sensors taken from both satellites and helicopters of the ground surface. So what the temperatures are was determined and has been reported about by various government agencies. In this case, point A and point B are the two extremes of Building 7, the remains of Building 7. And the temperatures, as indicated by the colors there, are 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, which, as I'll tell you later, that's well, not only is it very hot and not easy to explain, but this type of imaging was done for several months later on a daily basis, and the temperatures persisted for many weeks. The top left-hand corner is, there were these iron-rich microspheres in the dust that was detected. In fact, it was so predominant that it was determined by independent testing agencies under contract for insurance company purposes. They determined that this was a characteristic that defined whether this is World Trade Center dust or some other kind of dust. No other dust has this kind of small sphere. And it's a sphere of metal that was later determined to be very rich in iron. So you can think of it as iron spheres. And the only way it could be a sphere is to have been extremely hot, actually be a liquid, prior to it cooling down. Because when it cools down from the liquid, the surface tension brings it into a sphere. That happens with any liquid as it solidifies. So that's hard evidence that the temperatures had to have been high enough for the metal, whether it was iron or whether it was steel, that has a component of iron in it. So these are all three pieces of hard evidence that we and the public know was in their room as a souvenir, put it in a bottle. You can imagine that kind of thing would happen. And then later on they hear that there's scientists that are asking if anyone has any samples of the dust. So samples came in, actually more than 4 samples, but there were 4 where the people who offered them were willing to provide their name and say that they would testify in court if it came to that. Some people wouldn't go that far, so their dust was not used. It was tested, and all of these tests of dust were all consistent with each other. There was one other interesting piece of sample of dust. It was gathered on one of the local bridges 10 minutes after the second tower came down. Very important, 10 minutes means it could not have been contaminated by cleanup operations afterwards. And since it was not contaminated, and it agreed very consistently with the other samples, then that gives confidence of saying, yes, the dust samples were valid, and the results that came from them are something you can have confidence in. What was found was, it's called nanothermite. The nano part of that term means it's extremely small in width. So you can just think about how tiny it was. And it is not a natural phenomenon. It's engineered. You've got to have very sophisticated laboratories. Laboratories do research in nanotechnology, but the ones that do it in technology that can end up being weaponized, and which in terms of this are primarily, in fact, all that we know of, we in the public. We only know of government laboratories or private laboratory, industry laboratories that are sanctioned by the government and have whatever security clearances are necessary. So this material is of that nature. Another very important part is that it contains its own oxidizing agent. So it's manufactured, but it has everything it needs to do whatever it's designed to do. And we really can't tell at this point whether it was designed to be explosives or designed to be an incendiary to allow you to cut through metal at much lower temperatures than you otherwise would. So those kinds of questions would have to come out of a further investigation where you actually had subpoena power, and hopefully the government or some recognized authority would do that in the future days. So we can only go so far in saying what exactly did this provide. But the part of it where it provides its own oxidizing agent provides the answer to why did these temperatures persist for weeks after weeks after weeks, buried underneath rubble where oxygen from the air couldn't get to them. This is the answer to that question. And so there's a lot of cases where you get different bits and pieces of information, and when they all kind of come together in a consistent manner, then it gives you confidence that the different pieces of information are correct. And that's really what's happened in this case. Next chart. Okay, now, so given an agent, or given something that can be explosives, I'm not saying that's all of the explosives were there, but it's at least one of them that was there that shouldn't have been.